The week my life cracked open began with laughter in the kitchen and the smell of coffee warming the air, and I remember thinking, with a certainty that now feels almost naive, that nothing truly bad could happen to a woman whose mornings were still this gentle. I did not know then that peace can exist right up until the moment it is removed, quietly and without warning, like a chair pulled back just as you are about to sit. I had always believed that stability announced itself through dramatic milestones, through promotions or engagements or houses with keys that felt heavy in your palm, but my stability lived in smaller, more intimate rituals, such as the way my mother hummed while slicing fruit, the way my father cleared his throat before asking my opinion as though it mattered more than it did, the way my sister leaned against the counter and spoke to me as if I were the axis around which her decisions rotated. And the way the woman I loved reached for my hand in the car without looking, trusting that I would be there, always occupying the same familiar space. Nothing in my world felt fragile, and that was perhaps the most dangerous illusion of all, because fragility does not announce itself with noise, it hides inside routine, inside affection, inside the quiet confidence that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough that no preparation is required. My job was demanding in the way that validates you rather than drains you, the kind of work that made dinners taste better because they were earned, and I was good at it in a way that felt earned rather than lucky, respected without being resented, trusted without being tested, and when I spoke about it at family dinners, no one interrupted me, which I took as proof that I had arrived at a place where my voice carried weight. I was wrong, but not in any way that could have been measured then. That Monday morning unfolded like every other, with emails answered efficiently, meetings navigated calmly, and a brief text from my partner reminding me to eat lunch, a small act of care that felt so normal it barely registered as love, and when I left the office that evening, I did so with the comforting fatigue of someone who expects to return the next day to the same desk, the same responsibilities, the same sense of belonging. At home, my mother asked about my day with genuine interest. My father commented on an article I had sent him earlier in the week, and my sister complained about a problem she expected me to solve simply by listening, which I did, because that had always been my role, the stabilizer, the absorber, the one who made the sharp edges of other people's lives easier to hold. There were no arguments, no awkward pauses, no moments that demanded interpretation, and if someone had told me then that this was the last evening I would experience my family as a place of unquestioned safety, I would have laughed at the melodrama of it, because betrayal, in my understanding, required malice, and my home was full of love. The next few days passed with the same reassuring rhythm, my partner and I discussing future plans in the abstract way people do when they believe time is abundant, my mother reminding me to rest more, my sister asking for my opinion on things she had already decided, my father offering advice that came from habit rather than necessity, and all of it felt normal enough to dull any instinct for self-protection. It was on Thursday afternoon that the first undeniable interruption occurred, delivered not with cruelty or confrontation but with the sterile politeness of a scheduled meeting, during which I was told that my role was being eliminated due to restructuring, a phrase so smooth and impersonal that it barely seemed capable of altering a human life, and I listened, nodded, asked reasonable questions, and walked out with my composure intact, because I had been taught that dignity mattered most when circumstances did not. I did not cry in the elevator, nor did I call anyone immediately, because shock has a way of masquerading as calm, and I convinced myself that this was an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe, something to be explained away at dinner with reassurance and optimism, something that would resolve itself because surely things that were built carefully did not collapse overnight. When I told my family, they reacted exactly as loving people should, with sympathetic expressions, comforting words, and practical suggestions delivered swiftly, efficiently, almost too efficiently, as if they had already considered what such a moment would require, and I noticed, without assigning meaning to it, how quickly the conversation moved on, how smoothly my misfortune was absorbed into the flow of the evening without altering its tone. My partner held me that night and spoke about resilience and timing, about how capable I was, about how this would become a story we laughed about later, and I believed her, because belief was easier than uncertainty, and because nothing in her voice suggested anything other than care. The following day, I woke with a strange clarity, not yet grief, not yet fear, but an awareness that something fundamental had shifted, even if I could not articulate what it was, and I spent the morning updating documents, responding to messages of polite regret from colleagues, and reassuring everyone, including myself, that I was handling it well. At lunch, my sister called to tell me about an opportunity she was excited about, speaking quickly, almost nervously, and I listened, offered encouragement, and hung up feeling faintly unmoored, not because of jealousy, but because the timing felt oddly precise, as though the universe had redistributed energy without consulting me. That evening, my mother suggested we eat together again, her voice warm and steady, and I agreed, grateful for the familiarity, for the sense that my life still had anchors, and as we sat around the table, the conversation stayed carefully light, touching on topics that required no emotional labor from me, which I mistook for kindness rather than avoidance. I went to bed that night tired in a way that sleep could not resolve, my mind replaying ordinary moments with unusual intensity, searching for reassurance in patterns that had always been reliable, and I told myself, firmly, that this was simply the beginning of a transition, not the end of anything meaningful. The week concluded without drama, without confrontation, without tears, and that is what makes it so difficult to explain now, because nothing visibly broke, nothing announced itself as betrayal, nothing asked to be examined, and I ended those 7 days believing that I had lost a job but kept everything else intact, unaware that the foundations beneath my feet had already been rearranged, silently and completely. By Sunday night, as I prepared for the uncertain week ahead, I felt strangely proud of how composed I had remained, how supported I was, how loved, and I went to sleep convinced that whatever challenges waited for me would be faced from within the safety of the life I had built, never suspecting that the safety itself had already been withdrawn, and that this calm was not a blessing, but the last mercy before everything I trusted revealed its limits. The days after that week did not collapse into chaos the way people expect loss to behave. Instead, they stretched outward, thin and oddly quiet, as if my life had been placed on a shelf where it could still be seen but no longer touched, and I moved through them with a composure that impressed everyone except me, because I could feel something loosening inside my sense of belonging even though I had no language yet to describe it. Without the structure of my job, time became expansive in a way that felt unnatural, and I filled it carefully, waking early, exercising, applying for positions, maintaining the outward rituals of productivity so convincingly that my family praised my strength. Their approval offered generously but without curiosity, and I noticed, with mild confusion, that no one asked what I wanted to do next, only how quickly I planned to recover, as though restoration to usefulness was the only acceptable outcome. My mother checked in daily, her tone attentive but brief, always ending the conversation once she confirmed that I was coping, while my father offered advice that came from a place of resolution rather than empathy, focusing on efficiency, strategy, and optics, and I absorbed it all without resistance because disagreement would have required energy I was saving for survival. My sister, who had always relied on me as a sounding board, now spoke with a different cadence, her words more confident, her pauses fewer, her decisions already formed by the time she shared them, and I found myself listening to updates rather than participating in the shaping of them, a subtle shift that registered only as mild displacement at first, not yet as loss. The woman I loved remained physically present, still sharing meals, still sleeping beside me, but something in her attention had thinned, as though she were already adjusting to a version of me that no longer aligned with her future, and when she spoke about plans, my role in them sounded theoretical rather than assumed, a change so slight that pointing it out would have felt paranoid. I told myself this was normal, that people reacted differently to instability, that love required patience during transitions, and that if I felt uneasy, it was only because uncertainty has a way of making even familiar spaces feel temporary. Weeks passed, and the silence around my job loss grew louder not through absence but through redirection, conversations sliding away from me the moment they risked depth, decisions being made without my input, information arriving late or already concluded, and I began to feel as though I were observing my own life from just outside its perimeter, still visible, still welcome, but no longer central. The first moment of true dissonance arrived unexpectedly during a family gathering that should have felt ordinary, when my father mentioned a professional connection in passing, speaking casually about an upcoming role that had opened at my former company, and the ease with which he discussed it caught my attention not because of the information itself, but because of the familiarity in his tone. as though this development had been circulating for some time. I asked a neutral question, careful not to reveal the sudden alertness tightening in my chest, and his response was immediate but strangely polished, explaining the situation with practiced clarity, and while nothing he said was inappropriate, the cadence suggested preparation rather than spontaneity, a detail so small it could have been dismissed if it had not lodged itself so firmly in my awareness. Later that evening, my sister mentioned the same opportunity from a different angle, speaking with enthusiasm that bordered on relief, and the overlap of these conversations, occurring independently yet aligning too neatly, unsettled me in a way I could not articulate, because coincidence loses its innocence when it repeats itself too precisely. I did not confront anyone, not because I lacked courage, but because intuition without proof feels irresponsible, and I had been raised to value harmony over suspicion, to trust explanations rather than question motives, and so I filed the discomfort away, telling myself that families share information, that networks overlap, that my sensitivity was heightened by loss. It was only after my partner began to withdraw emotionally, framing her distance as concern rather than detachment, that the pattern sharpened into something harder to ignore, because the language she used echoed phrases I had heard at home, not verbatim, but close enough to feel borrowed, and I wondered, briefly and guiltily, how many conversations about me had occurred without me present. When she finally ended our relationship, she did so with composure and restraint, her reasoning delivered gently, focusing on stability, alignment, and emotional weight, and I listened without interruption, not because I agreed, but because I recognized the structure of the argument, the careful framing that allowed her to leave without appearing cruel, and I realized with a quiet, sinking clarity that this decision had been supported, if not initiated, elsewhere. The aftermath was not explosive, and perhaps that is what hurt the most, because grief that arrives politely leaves you no one to blame, and I found myself alone in a life that had not rejected me outright but had simply rearranged itself until I no longer fit comfortably within it. My family responded to the breakup with concern that felt appropriate but limited, their sympathy offered in controlled doses, as though too much engagement might invite questions they preferred not to answer, and I sensed, without understanding why, that my pain was being managed rather than shared. In the solitude that followed, I began to replay conversations not with suspicion but with curiosity, noticing how often my struggles had been framed as burdens, how frequently my competence had been acknowledged alongside subtle relief at my absence, how easily my displacement had been integrated into the rhythm of everyone else's progress. There was no single revelation, no dramatic moment of discovery, only the gradual accumulation of small realizations that shifted my understanding from personal failure to contextual awareness, and I began to see that what had happened to me was not accidental, but neither was it overtly malicious, existing instead in the grey space where self-interest dresses itself as concern. By the end of that season, I understood something essential, even if I could not yet name it aloud. I had not been pushed out of my life by strangers or circumstance, but eased aside by people who believed, sincerely, that they were doing what was best for themselves, and perhaps even for me, and that knowledge settled quietly into my chest, heavy but clarifying, marking the moment when my grief transformed into something steadier, something that would not fade with time, but would instead reshape it. I did not decide to leave in a single, cinematic moment, because nothing about that period of my life lent itself to clarity or drama, and the idea of departure formed slowly, assembling itself out of practical considerations and emotional fatigue until one morning I realized that staying had begun to require more justification than going, and that realization arrived not with sadness, but with an unexpected sense of relief. I stopped explaining myself first, then I stopped volunteering updates, and finally I stopped arranging my schedule around other people's expectations. Small changes that drew no comment because they were framed as recovery, as self-focus, as the reasonable behavior of someone rebuilding, and in that camouflage I found the freedom to reshape my days without interference. Work came back into my life quietly, not as a return to what I had lost, but as a lateral movement into a space adjacent to it, contract-based at first, demanding competence without offering permanence, which suited me because permanence had begun to feel like a liability rather than a goal, and I approached each project with a focus sharpened by absence, determined not to be indispensable, but to be undeniable. I relocated under the guise of opportunity, a city far enough away to justify distance without severing connection, and I framed the move carefully, emphasizing convenience, growth, logistics, never emotion, because emotion invites questions, and I was no longer interested in being understood, only in being unencumbered. My family reacted with encouragement that felt performative but sincere enough to pass, and I accepted it without resistance, understanding now that their approval was most generous when it required nothing of them, and I maintained contact with the ease of someone who had learned that proximity was not the same as intimacy. The woman who had left me reached out occasionally, her messages polite, supportive, detached, and I responded in kind, not out of longing, but out of discipline, because bitterness reveals itself too easily through silence, and I did not want my absence to be interpreted as injury or protest, only as progression. In the years that followed, my life expanded in ways that surprised me, not because they were extraordinary, but because they were cumulative, each step building on the last with a quiet logic that rewarded consistency rather than ambition, and I learned to trust momentum more than intention, allowing myself to grow without narrating the process to anyone who did not need to know. I developed a reputation not for brilliance or innovation, but for reliability under pressure, for seeing systems rather than positions, for understanding how decisions moved through organizations and where they stalled, and this made me useful in rooms where outcomes mattered more than credit, rooms I entered not as a guest, but as a function. Through this work, I met people who existed at the intersections of power and process, consultants, board members, advisors, individuals whose influence was subtle but durable, and I engaged with them professionally, never hinting at my personal history, never aligning myself emotionally, because alliances built on competence endure longer than those built on sympathy. I kept my family informed in broad strokes, offering updates that were accurate but incomplete, and they received them with what appeared to be pride, my progress fitting neatly into a narrative of resilience that allowed them to feel vindicated in their earlier distance, and I let them have that comfort because it cost me nothing and revealed much. Over time, the imbalance I had once felt reversed itself so gradually that it was almost imperceptible, my absence creating space that others filled temporarily, while my presence, when required, carried weight precisely because it was no longer assumed, and I watched from a careful distance as roles shifted, dependencies formed, and vulnerabilities emerged. I did not plan revenge during this period, not because I lacked anger, but because anger would have narrowed my vision, and what I needed was perspective, the ability to see how lives interconnected beyond intention, how decisions compounded, how influence accumulated quietly until it appeared sudden to those who had not been paying attention. By the time I realized that my work now intersected indirectly with my family's professional world, the realization felt less like an opportunity and more like an inevitability, the natural result of operating within overlapping systems long enough for paths to cross again, and I did not resist it because resistance would have implied fear. I maintained the discipline of neutrality, treating every engagement with the same standards, every request with the same scrutiny, and when my name began to circulate in contexts familiar to my family, I heard about it only through casual mentions, delivered with a tone that suggested pride tinged with something less comfortable, something unexamined. What mattered most during this time was not the distance I had created, but the internal shift that accompanied it, the gradual replacement of seeking approval with cultivating autonomy, of needing to be seen with choosing when to be visible, and I recognized that whatever reckoning awaited us all would not be initiated by confrontation, but by presence. By the end of those years, I had become someone my former life would have required permission to accommodate, and the absence of that permission was no longer a barrier, but a feature, shaping a version of myself that did not need to announce her return in order to be felt, because the groundwork had already been laid, patiently and without spectacle, for what would come next. I did not announce my return as a homecoming, nor did I frame it as reconciliation, because neither would have been honest, and instead I arrived the way professionals do when they are needed rather than welcomed, through calendars, contracts, and introductions that left no room for sentiment or negotiation. The first time I saw my sister across a conference table rather than a kitchen counter, the recognition flickered across her face so quickly it might have been imagined, but the way her posture adjusted, the way her voice recalibrated itself before she spoke, confirmed that something fundamental had shifted, and I greeted her with the same composed warmth I offered everyone else, careful not to claim familiarity in a space governed by roles rather than relationships. Our work intersected naturally, her project requiring oversight from the firm I represented, and the alignment was presented as coincidence, though we both understood that coincidence, like opportunity, favors those prepared to accept it, and I conducted myself with professional precision, asking necessary questions, setting standards, and offering guidance without indulgence, because indulgence invites interpretation, and interpretation would have diluted the clarity of what was unfolding. My father encountered me next, introduced by a third party as a subject matter expert whose assessment would be critical to an upcoming compliance review, and I observed, without satisfaction or cruelty, the way his confidence faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered, extending his hand with practiced ease, addressing me by my surname, as though distance could be re-established through formality. I treated him with respect calibrated to his position rather than our history, never referencing the past, never signaling recognition beyond what the context required, and in doing so, I forced him to navigate a version of me that existed outside the familiar hierarchy of family, one that did not defer, did not seek reassurance, and did not soften expectations for comfort's sake. My mother's awareness arrived last, filtered through social networks and professional whispers, her initial pride tempered by unease as she realized that my presence was no longer something she could manage through affection or narrative, and when she called to suggest dinner, framing it as celebration, I accepted without enthusiasm or refusal, understanding that avoidance would have appeared defensive, and defense was unnecessary. At that dinner, the conversation stayed meticulously polite, every topic chosen for safety, every exchange measured, and I participated with ease, neither withholding nor oversharing, allowing the tension to exist without attempting to resolve it, because resolution would have offered relief, and relief was not yet warranted. The woman who had left me appeared on the periphery of my reentry, observing rather than approaching, her gaze lingering during public events where our paths crossed professionally, and I recognized in her expression not longing or regret, but disorientation, the discomfort of realizing that the version of me she had understood was incomplete, constructed through repetition rather than knowledge. As my involvement deepened, the consequences of my role became unavoidable, not because I enforced them harshly, but because I enforced them consistently, applying standards that revealed weaknesses rather than exploiting them, and each family member encountered their own reflection in that process, forced to confront decisions they had made when they believed they would never intersect with me again. My sister struggled first, her confidence wavering as timelines tightened and accountability sharpened, and I supported her professionally without rescuing her personally, offering solutions that required her to assume responsibility rather than deflect it, and in that dynamic, our former closeness resurfaced only as memory, not as leverage. My father's discomfort manifested differently, his authority challenged not through opposition but through transparency, and I watched as he adapted to a framework where influence required compliance rather than persuasion, his respect for me recalibrated not through sentiment, but through necessity. My mother attempted mediation, reaching out with concern framed as care, suggesting that perhaps my position placed me under undue strain, and I reassured her gently, truthfully, that I was exactly where I needed to be, a statement that unsettled her because it resisted reinterpretation. Throughout this period, I remained outwardly unchanged, maintaining the same composure, the same professionalism, the same restraint, and it was this consistency that proved most destabilizing, because it offered no emotional entry point, no opportunity to negotiate terms through familiarity or guilt. What none of them could articulate, but all of them felt, was the shift from being actors in my life to being subjects within its structure, not targeted, not punished, but undeniably affected, and I understood then that revenge did not require spectacle or cruelty, only the patience to allow reality to realign itself around truth. By the time my role became indispensable, by the time decisions paused until my assessment was complete, by the time my absence would have caused disruption rather than relief, the balance had fully inverted, and I stood at the center of a system that once excluded me, not as a conqueror, but as a constant, and I knew that the final resolution would not arrive through escalation, but through closure, deliberate and irrevocable. On my terms. I chose the end carefully, not because I feared confrontation, but because endings determine meaning, and I refused to let mine be defined by accusation, emotion, or spectacle, and so I arranged a private meeting that carried no urgency, no threat, no implication of reckoning, presenting it instead as a practical necessity. A closing conversation required before I transitioned out of my role and out of their lives in any meaningful way. We met in a neutral space, not the family home and not a corporate office, but a quiet room designed for decisions rather than memories, and when they arrived one by one, I observed them with a calm that surprised even me, because time and distance had transformed them into people I understood without needing to forgive, and understanding, I had learned, was far more powerful than absolution. I began by explaining my departure in professional terms, outlining the next steps, the continuity plans, the assurances that no disruption would follow my exit, and I watched the tension ease from their faces as they realized this was not a reckoning in the way they had feared, not a moment where grievances would be aired or history rewritten aloud, and it was only once that relief settled that I spoke the truth I had come to deliver. I told them that I had always known, not the details or the conversations word for word, but the shape of what they had done, the way my displacement had been facilitated rather than resisted, the way my struggles had been reframed as liabilities, the way opportunities had opened for others precisely when mine had closed, and I spoke without accusation, without raising my voice, because truth does not require intensity to be devastating. The realization moved through the room unevenly, my sister's composure fracturing first as she understood that her advancement had not occurred in isolation, that the timing she had once dismissed as fortunate was inseparable from my removal, and her discomfort was not guilt alone, but the recognition that she had accepted a narrative that spared her from asking difficult questions. My father absorbed the truth differently, his expression tightening not with denial but with calculation, replaying decisions he had justified as pragmatic, necessary, inevitable, and seeing now how those justifications had been shaped by the assumption that I would endure, that I always did, and that assumption, once exposed, left him with nowhere to stand. My mother's reaction was quiet, her distress rooted not in surprise, but in recognition, because she had known more than she admitted, had sensed the imbalance and chosen peace over inquiry, believing that harmony required sacrifice, and she had never imagined that the sacrifice would someday speak back. I told them that I had not returned to punish them, nor to reclaim anything they believed they had taken, because what I had lost could not be restored through acknowledgement, and what I had gained could not be diminished by apology, and I explained that my revenge, if it could be called that, had been to become someone they could no longer manage, reinterpret, or quietly move aside. The darkest secret, the one they had never confronted even internally, was revealed without flourish. They had not acted together, nor had they colluded openly, each believing themselves to be the exception, the reasonable one, the necessary actor responding to circumstances rather than creating them, and it was this isolation, this private justification, that had allowed the betrayal to exist without resistance. I told them that I was leaving not because I was finished, but because I was complete, that my presence had served its purpose, that the systems would continue without me, and that they would go on with lives shaped subtly but permanently by the knowledge that they had misjudged the person they thought would always absorb the cost. No one asked for forgiveness, and I did not offer it, not out of cruelty, but because forgiveness would have implied a wound still open, and mine had closed into something firmer, something quieter, something that no longer required their participation. When I walked away, there was no dramatic exit, no lingering glance, no final word meant to echo, because closure does not need an audience, and as I stepped back into a life that belonged wholly to me, I understood with absolute certainty that the revenge was complete not because they suffered, but because I did not need them to. The woman who had once left me saw the ending from a distance, not through confrontation, but through absence, realizing too late that the story she had believed was incomplete, and that the future she had chosen had been built on a misunderstanding she could never correct. The story ends here, not with reconciliation or ruin, but with clarity, with every thread resolved, every silence explained, every consequence accounted for, and I move forward unburdened, not because I escaped what was done to me, but because I returned, reshaped the landscape, and left it behind by choice, carrying nothing with me except the certainty that my life, finally and irrevocably, is my own.